do not remember our mother, but Jem did. He would tell me about her sometimes, and he went livid when Mrs. Dubois shot us this message. Jem, having survived Boo Radley, a mad dog, and other terrors, had concluded that it was cowardly to stop Miss Rachel's front steps and wait, and had decreed that we must run as far as the post office corner each evening to meet Atticus coming from work. Countless evenings Atticus would find Jem furious at Miss Dubois and said when we went by, "Easy does it, son," Atticus would say. "She's an old lady and she's ill. You just hold your head high and be a gentleman. Whatever she says to you, it's your job not to let her make you mad," Jem would say, as she must not be very sick, she hollered so. When the three of us came to her house, Atticus would sweep off his hat, wave gallantly to her, and say, "Good evening, Mrs. Dubois. You look like a picture this evening." I never heard Atticus say, "Like a picture of what?" He would tell her the courthouse news, and would say he hoped with all of his heart she would have a good day tomorrow. He would return his hat to his head, swing me to his shoulders in her very presence, and we would go home in the twilight. It was like times like this when I thought my father, who hated guns and has never been to any wars, was the bravest man who ever lived. The day after Jim's 12th birthday, his money was burning up his pockets, so we headed for town in the early afternoon. Jim thought he had enough to buy a miniature steam engine for himself and a twirly baton for me. I had long had my eye on this baton. It was at V.J. Elmore's. It was bedecked with sequins and tinsels. It cost 17 cents. It was then my burning ambition to grow up and twirl with the Maycomb County High School Band. Having developed my talent to where I could throw up a stick and almost catch it coming down, I had caused Capunia to deny me entrance to the house every time she saw me with a stick in my hand. I felt that I could overcome this defect with a real baton. I thought it was generous of Jem to buy one for me. Mrs. Voss was stationed on her porch when we went by. "Where are you two going at this time of day?" she shouted. "Playing hooky, I suppose? I'll call up the principal and tell him." She put her hands on her wheels of her chairs and executed a perfect right face. "Aw, it's Saturday, Mrs. Dubois." "Makes no difference if it's Saturday," she said obscurely. "I wonder if your father knows where you are." Mrs. Dubois, we've been going to town by ourselves since we were this high." Jem placed his hand, palm down, about 2 feet above the sidewalk. "Don't you lie to me," she yelled. "Jeremy Finch, Maudie Atkinson, told me you broke down her Scuppernong arbor this morning. She's going to tell your father, and then you'll wish you never saw the light of day. If you aren't sent to reform school by next week, my name's not your boss." Jem, who hadn't been near Miss Maudie's Scuppernong arbor since last summer, and knew Miss Maudie wouldn't tell Atticus that he had, issued a general denial. "Don't you contradict me," Mrs. Dubois bawled, "and you," she pointed an arthritic finger at me. "What are you doing in those overalls? You should be in a dress, camel sole, young lady. You'll grow up waiting on tables if someone doesn't change your ways. A Finch waiting on tables at the OK Cafe. Ha!" I was terrified. The OK Cafe was a dim organization on the north side of the square. I grabbed Jem's hand, but he shook me loose. "Come on, Scout," he whispered. "Don't pay attention to her. Just hold your head high and be a gentleman." But Mrs. Dubois held us. Not only a Finch waiting on tables, but one in the courthouse longing for the N-word. Jem stiffened. Mrs. Dubois' shot had gone home, and she knew it. Yes, indeed. What has this world come to when a Finch goes against his raising? I'll tell you. She put her hand in her mouth. When she drew it away, it trailed a long silver thread of saliva. "Your father is no better than the N-words in the trash he works for." Jem was scarlet. I pulled at his sleeves, and we were followed up the sidewalk by a philippic on our family's moral degeneration, the major premise of which was that half the Finches were in the asylum anyway. But if our mother were living, we would not have come to such a state. I wasn't sure what Jem resented most, but I took umbrage at Mrs. Dubois' assessment of the family's mental hygiene. I had become almost accustomed to hearing insults aimed at Atticus, but this was the first one coming from an adult. Except for her remarks about Atticus, Mrs. Dubois' attack was only routine. There was a hint of summer in the air. In the shadows it was cool, but the sun was warm, which meant good times were coming, no school, and dill. Jim bought his steam engine and we went by Elmore's for my baton. Jim took no pleasure in his acquisition. He jammed it in his pocket and walked silently beside me toward home. On the way home, I nearly hit Miss Link Diaz, who said, "Look out now, Scout," when I missed a toss and we approached Mrs. Dubas's house by my baton was grimy from having picked it up out of the dirt so many times. She was not on the porch. In later years, I sometimes wonder exactly what made Jem do it, what made him break the bonds of "you'll just be a gentleman's son" and the phrase of self-conscious rectitude he had recently entered. Jem had probably stood as much gruff about Atticus longing for the N-words as I, and I took it for granted that he kept his temper. He had a naturally tranquil disposition and a slow fuse. At the time, however, I thought the only explanation for what he did was that for a few minutes he simply went mad. What Jem did was something I'd do as a matter of course had I not been under Atticus' interdict, which I assumed including not fighting horrible old ladies. We had just come up to her gate when Jem snatched my baton and ran flailingly wild up to the steps of Mrs. DeBoss's front yard, forgetting everything Atticus had said, forgetting that she packed a pistol under her shawls, forgetting that Miss DeBoss missed her girl Jessie probably wouldn't. He did not begin to calm down until he had cut the tops of every camellia bush Mrs. DeBoss owned, until the ground was littered with green buds and leaves. He bent my baton against his knee, snapped it in two, and threw it down. By that time I was shrieking. Jem yanked my hair, and he didn't care. He'd do it again if he got the chance, and if I didn't shut up, he'd pull out every hair of my head. I didn't shut up, and he kicked me. I lost my balance and fell on my face. Jem picked me up roughly, but he looked like he was sorry. There is nothing to say. We did not choose to meet Atticus coming home that evening. We skulked around the kitchen until Capunia threw us out. By some voodoo system, Capunia seemed to know all about it. She was a less than satisfactory source of palliation, but she did give Jem a hot biscuit and butter, which he tore in half and shared with me. It tastes like cotton. We went into the living room, and I picked up a football magazine, found a picture of Dixie Howell, and showed it to Jem. "This looks like you." That was the nicest thing I could say to him, but it was no help. He sat by the windows, hunched down in a rocking chair, scowling and waiting. Daylight faded. 2 geological ages later, we heard the soles of Atticus' shoes scrape the front steps, the screen door slammed, and there was a pause. Atticus was at the hat rack in the hall, where he heard him call, "Jem!" His voice was like the winter wind. Atticus switched on the ceiling light in the living room, found us there, frozen still. He carried my baton in one hand. Its filthy yellow tassel trailed on the rug. He held out the other hand, and it contained a fat camellia buds. "Jem," he said, "are you responsible for this?" He said, "Yes, sir." "Why'd you do it?" Jem said softly. "She said you had lied for N-words and trash." "You did this because she said that?" Jem lips moved, but his "yes, sir" was inaudible. "Son, I have no doubt that you've been annoyed by the contemporaries about me longing for the N-words, as you say, but to do something like this to a sick old lady is inexcusable. I strongly advise that you go down and have a talk with Miss Dubas," said Atticus. "Come straight home afterward." Jem did not move. "Go on," I said. I followed Jem out of the living room. "Come back here," Atticus said to me. I came back. Atticus picked up a mobile press and sat down in a rocking chair Jem had vacated. For the life of me, I did not understand how he could sit there in cold blood and read a newspaper while his only son stood an excellent chance of being murdered with a Confederate Army relic. Of course, Jem antagonized me, and sometimes until I could kill him. But when it came down to it, he was all I had. Atticus did not seem to realize this, or if he did, he didn't care. I hated him for that. But when you are in trouble and you become easily tired, soon I was hiding in his lap, and his arms were around me. You're mighty big to me, Rocht," he said. "You don't care what happens to him," I said. "You just sent him to get shot, and when all he was doing was standing up for you." Atticus pushed my head under his chin. "It's not time to worry yet," he said. "I never thought Jim would be the one to lose his head over this. Thought I'd have more trouble with you." I said I didn't see why we had to keep our heads anyways, that nobody I knew at school had to keep his head about anything. Scout, said Atticus, when summer comes you have to keep your head about far worse things. It's not fair for you, and I know that, but sometimes we have to make the best of things. And the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down, well, all I can say is that when you and Jem are grown, maybe you'll look back on this with some compassion and some feeling that I didn't let you down. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes for the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man. Atticus, you must be wrong. How's that? Well, most folks seem to think that they're right and you're wrong. They're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to the full respect for their opinions. But before I can live with other folks, I got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. When Jim returned, he found me still in Atticus's lap. Well, son, said Atticus. He set me on my feet and made a secret reconnaissance of Jem. He seemed to be an all-in-one piece, but he had a queer look on his face. Perhaps she had given him a dose of calomel. I cleaned it up for her and said I was sorry, but I ain't, and that I'd work on them every Saturday to try and make them grow back out. There's no point in saying that you were sorry if you aren't, said Atticus. She's old and ill. You can't hold her responsible for what she says and does. Of course, I'd rather she have said that to me than to either of you, but we can't always have our druthers. Jem seemed fascinated by a rose in the carpet. Atticus, he said, she wants me to read to her. Read to her? Yes, sir. She wants me to come every afternoon after school and Saturdays and read to her aloud for 2 hours. Atticus, do I have to? Certainly. But she wants me to do it for a month. But then you'll do it for a month. Jem planted his big toe delicately in the center of the rose and pressed it in. Finally, he said, Atticus, it's all right on the sidewalk, but it's inside. It's all dark and creepy. There are shadows and things on the ceiling. Atticus smiled grimly. That should appeal to your imagination. Just pretend you're inside the Radley house.